first on the agenda will be Emily Moore. She's assistant professor of art history at Colorado State, where she teaches Native American and American art history courses, among others. She got her MA and PhD in the history of art from UC Berkeley, and has an MFA in creative writing from West Virginia University. Professor Moore's research focuses on contemporary and historic North American Native arts, and she's an adopted member of the Kiksutty clan. Emily?
Thank you, Steve. Can everyone hear me? I have a soft voice. I want to begin by acknowledging the Aquan peoples on whose land we stand and the work of all the organizers to make this gathering possible. It's a wonderful conference to come to. I also want to acknowledge that this is the third clan conference that I've given a paper on the New Deal totem parks, and Tom Thornton was talking earlier about being a one-trick pony, and I promise I will eventually move on to another project. But I really find so much compelling about this New Deal program. And just to give you a very brief overview before I plunge right into the paper, this was a CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps program, during the Depression when President Roosevelt put Tlingit and Haida men back to work by restoring or replicating 19th century totem poles and then re-erecting them in these 6 totem parks that we now have in Southeast Alaska. So that's the subject of this paper. In December 1938, the Town Council of Klawock called a meeting of Tlingit clan leaders to discuss a radical new proposal from the U.S. Forest Service to remove 19th century totem poles from Klawock's ancestral village of Tuxacan and to restore those poles for a totem park built by Tlingit men. The meeting lasted well into the night as clan leaders discussed the strange new proposals of the Forest Service program, removing poles from the sites where their ancestors had erected them, restoring poles rather than allowing them to naturally decay, and re-erecting poles where tourists could more easily see them. Robert J. Peradovich Jr., the Tlingit mayor of Klawock, reported in a letter to Forest Service District Ranger C.M. Archbold that clan leaders at the meeting adamantly opposed moving poles, quote, whose owners requested they deteriorate on their own graves, and no individual, regardless of his rank in the tribe, can order them moved, and which is only a supreme respect and tribute to those that erected these certain poles. However, Peradovich reported that the clan leaders found that, quote, certain other poles could be moved to Klawock for restoration, but they made one important caveat, and you can see I underlined it in this letter that I found in my copy from the National Archives. It was requested that the poles be erected on community-owned property rather than on government-owned property. Not and only then would they, the claimants to the poles, give consent to have these poles moved to Klawock for restoration. Peradovich's note here may not seem especially significant, but in my talk this afternoon, I want to highlight it as one of the many links between the CCC restoration program of totem poles and Tlingit and Haida efforts to establish Aboriginal title in the interwar years. Since 1909, when 17 million acres of Southeast Alaska had been set aside as the Tongass National Forest, without any payment or negotiating with indigenous peoples of that land, Tlingit and Haida clans had protested the government's appropriation of fishing, hunting, and gardening sites that they had used for generations. In 1929, the Alaska Native Brotherhood voted to make Aboriginal claims against the federal government their #1 priority. And in 1935, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed an act allowing the Tlingit and Haida to sue the federal government for compensation for land loss to the Tongass National Forest. Peradovich's letter in 1938, then, came at the same time that his uncles, Frank and Roy Peradovich, leaders in the A&B in the late 1930s, were organizing A&B membership for the lawsuit against the U.S. government. Further, many of the men who worked for the CCC would later testify in hearings on Aboriginal claims. The Totem Pole Restoration Program of 1938 to 1942 thus took place within a highly fraught context, one where Tlingit and Haida communities were cooperating with the U.S. Forest Service on restoring totem poles at the same time that they were contesting that agency's right to administer their ancestral lands. So we've always understood these parks as being something that Tlingit and Haida communities agreed to participate in because of the desperate economic situation of the Depression, but I really think that there's a link also to this desire to establish Aboriginal claims in the 30s. So how could totem poles convince the US government to recognize Aboriginal claims? Totem poles acted as mnemonics for important histories of clans, pointing to vast oral histories that chronicled clan origins, migrations across the land, and ancestral encounters with animals and other entities that clans then claimed as their identifying crests. The Cots pole, replicated for the Saxman Totem Park from Tonga's village, for example, was said to be the fourth of its kind carved for the Tequati people, and recalled a history of Tequati clan sites across more than 200 years, from the Unuk River to Cape Muzon to the west coast of Prince of Wales Island, and finally to Tonga's village. Other poles were direct statements of land title owned by certain families. The Sockeye pole restored for the Totem Park at Klawock was an explicit record of title and was actually cited in federal documents on Tlingit land claims against the federal government. The property, a salmon stream at Deweyville on the western shore of Prince of Wales Island, was represented by a face near the bottom of the pole with a basket of salmon. At the top of the pole was a brown bear, the crest of the clan that owned the salmon stream. Another pole restored for the Klawock Totem Park, the Spirit of Hazy Island pole, recorded the title of the winter people to Hazy Island, which was a nesting place for numerous seabirds, including the meres depicted at the pole's top. Viola Garfield, who was the anthropologist hired to record the stories of the totem poles for the U.S. Forest Service, wrote in The Wolf and the Raven that, quote, "The winter people had the exclusive right to gather mere eggs from the island, and they regard the bird as one of their special crests. The totem pole serves to publicize their ownership of this island." So what I think is so great is that this book that came out, The Wolf and the Raven, was U.S. Forest Service officials going around collecting stories related to the poles, and so many of those stories recorded clan claims to the land. So the Forest Service was actively gathering information on clan claims to the land, even at the same time as they were negating Aboriginal title. I think it's brilliant. And I wanted to bring in these quotes. I'm really interested in the work of Charles Brown, who was a Tlingit carver, Nech'adi carver down in Saxman. And he was a really important, he was someone who went around and interviewed a lot of elders about the stories behind the totem poles that he was restoring for the Saxman Park. And just last summer, I found here in Juneau, in Lynn Forrest's son's home. Lynn Forrest was the U.S. Forest Service architect who oversaw all of these totem parks. He has several manuscripts that were originally typed by Charles Brown as he was preparing stories that would later be published in The Wolf and the Raven. And what I'm so taken by is that Charles Brown, you can see here he argues against migration theories of his people from Asia. He argues we've always been here. All of our stories tell us that we've always been here. And he was really arguing for Aboriginal title to this land from time immemorial. None of that got put into The Wolf and the Raven. That was all of his unpublished writings. Another striking feature of the New Deal totem parks was that several Native leaders who agreed to the CCC restoration program pressured the Forest Service for totem parks on Native townsite land, where Native people would have clear title to the poles, rather than leaving the poles in situ in the Tongass National Forest. Paul Morrison, the Haida mayor of Heidelberg, was one of the first Native leaders to advocate for a central totem park at Heidelberg, rather than restoring poles in Sakwan, Haukan, and Klinkwan as the Forest Service had originally planned. In a 1938 report, a U.S. Forest Service official included a photograph of Morrison. You can see in the caption he noted he was a very intelligent Native. The report also noted Morrison's suggestion to build a central park at Heidelberg adding that he mentioned that since Heidelberg is made up of natives from all three villages, Sakwan, Haukan, and Klinkwan, that permission for moving the totems could be easily secured. At first, the Forest Service rejected this suggestion, saying that if totem poles had to be moved to a central location, they should be centralized at one of the larger towns where more tourists stop. Eventually, however, native pressure for a central park on village town site land won out at Heidelberg and at all but 2 of the CCC totem parks. At Kasan, for example, the Forest Service reported that local Haidas, quote, favored publicly owned town site lands within their present village of New Kasan, which stands some 15 miles from Old Kasan Monument. There seems to be no sentiment to erect the poles at Old Kasan or to move them to Ketchikan. So my point is that a lot of these native leaders wanted totem poles to be grounded on native town site land. This was a diagram I found in the National Archives of different town site blocks within Heidelberg, and the Heidelberg Town Council allotted block 24 and 55 for this totem park because it would be on native town site land. They did not want to leave the totem poles in the Tongass National Forest where title was still contested with the U.S. government. If they moved them to their town site land, the new laws of the Indian Reorganization Act in the 1930s had assured some ownership there. It would be a more clear native title. The last fact that I want to bring up is that many of the same men who worked for the CCC were also A and B members and would later testify in hearings held to determine possessory rights of the Tlingit and Haida in both the 1944 Hanna hearings in Klawock, Cake, and Heidelberg, or the 1946 Goldschmidt and Haas interviews that are documented in the book Ha'ani. James Peel, the lead carver for the CCC at Kasan, testified that Haida trappers had once kept cabins at Sunny Point, but, quote, we have found that we can't keep cabins because they will be destroyed by the whites, unquote. Thomas Eucas, the lead carver for the CCC camp at Wrangell, stated, quote, there was a smokehouse at Cooney Cove which belonged to the Kutch Udi people, but there is nothing there now because the cannery people have claimed this area. Burnett Island was used for hunting and there was a cabin there, but now we are kept out. Henry Denny Sr., a CCC leader at Saxman, reiterated a common complaint when he testified in 1946, my people own the area at the mouth of the Unik River. I have used that area all of my life, and before me, my fathers and uncles hunted and trapped and fished in that area. Now, however, it is closed to me because there are homesteaders there. Denny did not mention the harassment that he and his family had encountered when they had tried to assert their claims to the homesteader, but several other Saxman men testified that a white homesteader had run Denny out of his smokehouse with a gun, and that Denny's wife was so scared she begged him never to return. Denny's retreat would later be judged by American courts as his abandonment of ancestral lands, a judgment that effectively punished him for nonviolence. The correlation between the men who testified for Aboriginal claims in the 1940s and men who worked for the CCC from 1938 to 1942 suggests to me that land claims had to be on the minds of Tlingit and Haida men who participated in the Totem Pole Restoration Program. The majority of these men were also members of the Alaska Native Brotherhood, which was actively pursuing land claims against the federal government. Agreeing to the Forest Service Totem Pole Restoration Program was not simply an act of desperation then, of economic desperation, but of a way to make the program meet their own cultural and political needs. And I'll just close with this last photograph. This is James Peel of Kasan. He was posing with the central house post of the Whale House in Kasan, Neiwans. And Forest Service officials really pressed him, what is the story behind this pole? We want to record this story for The Wolf and the Raven. And this is finally what Lynn Forrest wrote. The story of the central totem Mr. Peel was unable to tell in English. After a lengthy discussion in Haida with some of the other natives, he said it was called the head house totem, and then explained it as follows, and I have this quote. In the earlier days, each tribe claimed strict rights to designated areas, including hunting grounds, berry fields, and fishing waters. Within these areas, each family owned certain districts and had hereditary claims to them. Generally, these areas were respected by the various tribes, and trespass was uncommon. However, should a group of foreign natives be found on another tribe's property, hunting or fishing, all would be killed except one. This one being spared to return to the village with the bodies of his companions, and in that way to be left to explain why misfortune had befallen him. Even in the gloss of the English translation, and the original Haida story had noted the exact property that the Yadas family had claimed, the warning in this story was clear: recognize the clan that claimed the land or face serious consequences. Perhaps Peel wished that the gravity of trespassing on other people's lands would not be lost on the Forest Service official who was asking for its story. Thank you.